My name is Hypatia Martinez, and I'm one of the mental health coordinators and the chairperson of the Diversity Committee and Inclusion on this campus, along with, where's my girl? Where's Christy? I don't see her. Christy Banks is the Assistant Director of Campus Activities and Multicultural Affairs. So as the committee, we were commissioned by our Executive Dean, Dean Keene, to ensure that the campus facilitates diversity trainings for you guys, and we do events that celebrate diversity, and we also lead dialogues on social justice and inclusion. So, in that spirit, we would like to welcome all of you to our annual dialogue on race, White Like Me, Reflections on Race. So Tim Weiss, who I have to tell you, as the mental health person, our job is to always kind of like practice mindfulness. I just met him a few seconds ago. This is like a bucket list thing for me, so if I seem a little nervous, I apologize, but I'm doing my breathing. But he is absolutely one of the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in America. He's spoken in all 50 states, at about 1,000 colleges, over 1,000 colleges and high schools, and community groups across the country. He's the author of 7 books, including his latest, Under the Influence, Shaming the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Sacrificing the Future of America, and his highly acclaimed memoir, and the book that brought him into my life and into this work, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. He's also the host. I know a lot of you guys listen to podcasts. He has an amazing bi-weekly podcast called Speak Out with Tim Weiss. And he has appeared on hundreds of radio and television programs and is a regular contributor on discussions about race on CNN. The last thing I will say about him, and I think it's important to point out, is that he has an amazing way about talking about injustice and social justice. And he brings that in a way that we realize that racism and white privilege impacts everybody, regardless of your color. So I would like to welcome someone who I just recently learned is considered top 8 or one of the top wokest white people in America. So please put your hands together for Tim Weiss.
Thank you. So, a couple things. First, it's good to be back, and I say back because I was actually here in this very room 22 years ago, which makes me feel incredibly old, November of 1996, which I realize is probably before some of you were on the planet, so that really sucks for me. And I want to say, just to give you an idea of how much time has passed, when I was here before, I was listening to the intro, my bio, and I know for a fact that back in 96, my bio read, because I wasn't one of America's leading yet, I wasn't that. I was, however, apparently, according to my bio, one of America's leading young social critics. But of course, I was 28, so that young shit went out the window a long time ago, because I'm going to be 50 in like a week. So Bill Clinton had just been elected the second time. Like, a lot has changed, and a lot has just gone completely off the rails in that 22 years, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. If you had told me at that time that 22 years later I'd be back in this space talking about some of these same issues related to race and racism in America, I would not have at all been surprised. Disappointed, of course, to think that we were still struggling with a lot of the same subject matter, but not surprised because for those of you older than myself in the room, you know that we've grappled with this, and not too expertly, for hundreds of years, not just for a couple of decades. So there's nothing shocking about it, but it is disappointing that still we as a country haven't really gotten our shit together when it comes to the issue of race and racism in America, and I apologize to the sign language interpreter for making her sign shit now twice. Actually, 3 times now, because I just said it again, and it'll probably happen again, so, just so you know. As I was preparing for this event, I saw the official title, right, was this sort of title of my first book, White Like Me, Reflections on Race, or in the case of the book, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. And I can give that talk, and I will sort of dabble in that talk, but I wanted to do something a little different today because I've been thinking about some things in regard to this subject matter lately that I think are especially important right now. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is that the current racial divisions that exist in the country around all types of subject matter, which I'll cover in a few minutes, whether it's immigration, whether it's police misconduct and violence, the NFL football players' protest led by Colin Kaepernick early on a couple years back, whether it is the divide over Confederate statues that some apparently think we should keep up and others, including myself, want most certainly to take down. Whatever the issue is, whatever the divide is around subject matter regarding race, it is made worse, that divide, by the way in which we engage in selective memory, right? The way in which we choose which history to recall and which history to forget. Now, on one level, we all do this, right? Selective memory is sort of what people do. And I'm not even talking about in a historical, like, national sense. I mean just individuals, right? We all do it to an extent. We try to push aside painful memories from our past because they're painful. We'd rather not think about them. We try to play up the positive things of our childhood rather than the negative because it's easier to live with the positive. And if we've done harm to someone, whether it's a child in our own care or whether it's a family member or a friend, if we did somebody wrong, we don't like to remember that, right? We want to remember the good times, the good things we did, not the bad. So it's a very human instinct, and I get it. I do it, you do it, we all do it. And when we do that as individuals, it can be a problem, but it's sort of our problem, right? The dynamic that we create when we engage in selective memory and selective forgetting usually doesn't go outside the four walls of our home. It might screw up our family, but hopefully that's all it does. The problem is that when an entire nation does that, not about their personal story, but about their collective story, right? The problem is magnified many times over because when a country lies about itself, when a country decides to talk about the good but not deal with the bad, it guarantees that we never actually address and resolve the pain caused by the bad parts. We can never bind up the wounds created by that history that we've chosen to forget. It ensures that we'll never heal those wounds. The collective and systemic traumas that have been imposed upon millions of people and are still being imposed today. And we do this all the time. We engage in this selective memory regularly. We love to engage in selective memory. So, for instance, those of us called white in particular, right, love to tell black folks what we love to tell black folks, that they need to get over slavery because that was a really long-ass time ago, but then we turn around and set off fireworks on July 4th over some shit that was also a really long time ago, as in breaking away from the British. That didn't happen last Tuesday, remember. That was an old thing, but we still celebrate it. Why? Because it makes us feel good. So we don't want to forget that. Oh no, Independence Day, we're going to celebrate that because that makes us joyous. We just don't want to deal with the less than salutary aspects of the national history. We say things like, remember the Alamo. Why? That was a long time ago. And we don't even remember it accurately when we say that shit, right? We actually believe that that was a fight for independence rather than what it was, which was a fight to allow the bringing of and the keeping of slaves in the Texas territory. That's really what that was. But we lie about it, right? We say, remember Pearl Harbor. Why? That was a couple generations back now. We don't have to remember that. We say, remember 9/11. We're certainly never going to be allowed to forget that. But why? It was in the past. We love to remember the past when it either makes us feel heroic or allows us to feel like we were the victims. But we just don't want to deal with the past and the history that victimized other people. Whether it's the enslavement of African-descended folk, whether it's the theft of half of Mexico in a war of aggression that this nation most definitely started on false pretense, by the way, whether it is the genocide of indigenous people, whether it is the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, or the working from dawn to dusk and from dusk to dawn of Chinese labor brought over to build the railroads that form the transcontinental economy, where we would just work them to death for the growth of the American economy. We don't want to talk about that. Again, selective memory. That selective memory that we engage in is then ramped up to a fever pitch when you have a politician whose slogan for his campaign is what? Make America great again. Again, as in America used to be this really kick-ass place, but then something happened. But when exactly was America great? I mean, let's go through it, shall we? Was America great in the first 100 years of its existence, during which time African folk were enslaved, during which time indigenous people were being wiped off the planet or moved further and further away from their original homes on the continent? Was it great for women prior to the ability of women to vote? Keep in mind, women couldn't even, in many cases, get their own bank accounts and their own credit lines until the 1970s. Right? Within my lifetime, was America great for women of any color then? Was America great for black and brown folks under segregation when lynchings were a weekly occurrence? Was America great for LGBTQ folk forced into the closet, discriminated against as a matter of daily policy and routine? Was it great for poor people ever? Was it great when children were working in factories and in coal mines before we passed labor laws to at least theoretically protect them? Of course not. Was it great in the 1980s when the war on drugs got ramped up to a fever pitch and we began to see the mass and disproportionate incarceration of black and brown bodies, even though the data tells us white folks use drugs just as often or more so than black and brown folks, and we deal drugs just as often or more so than black and brown folks? That's what the data says, but that's not who's in jail and in prison for those crimes. Was it great then? When exactly has America ever been that place? And I know the governor of New York got in a lot of trouble for suggesting that America was never great. And then he backtracked. I ain't going to backtrack because I'm not a politician. I ain't running for shit. I'm just looking at the facts, you see. And the facts are that the history, now America's always had the potential of greatness. Don't misunderstand, right? And there's something to be said for that. My kids have the potential for greatness. They ain't there yet. They're 15 and 17. They got a little work to do. You know what I mean? Like, they're okay. Like, they were cool at 5 and 7, all right? They were good. But thank God they got better at 15 and 17. And if they don't get even better by 25 and 27, we're going to have a talk, right? And then they need to get even better by 35 and 37. Maybe by the time they're 50 or 60, they'll be great. But not yet. Same thing with the country. Why are we so insistent on claiming greatness when the bulk of our history says we are at best a work in progress and at worst a horrible failure and a contradiction? Maybe the truth is somewhere in between those two things. But whatever it is, we can't engage in this selective memory, and yet we do. But we only allow white folks to engage in it. Right? Because when people of color suggest that we might need to change things or move things, and that's the thing about, like, the response to Trump, all these folks that wear the MAGA hats, you know, made in China, by a guy that says he's all about bringing jobs back to this country, right? But they're mostly made in China because they're cheaper there, and he's all about the money, right? When they wear the MAGA gear, and they say, yeah, we need to make it great again. That's sort of like saying America sucks right now. So it's funny when they get mad at me for suggesting there are problems. It's funny when they get mad at people of color for suggesting there are problems. Because here's this rich white dude just basically stood up and says America sucks and we need to make it good. If black and brown folks say America sucks or even that America's flawed at all, people lose their mind, right? When the ball players take a knee, that's like saying we need to make America great again because it's not yet. And folks are like, what? You're not allowed to say that. When Barack Obama ran for president on a slogan of what? Hope and change, a lot of white folks lost our minds. We're like, change? We don't need to change anything. What do you want to change, black man? What's wrong with you, blackity black, black from Kenya, black man? What's wrong with you, right? That's what a lot of people said. We don't need to change America. America's just fine. Oh, but now it needs to be made great again. See, selective memory, right? Selective remembering, selective forgetting. We're doing this with immigration presently. Right? It's all about selective memory. The anger and the hostility being directed toward migrants from south of the border, always this border, please note, never this border, always this border. Apparently we're not worried about crafty Canadians sneaking in to take advantage of our superior health care system, because that would be weird after all. We're just worried about these folks. We're not worried about the fact, right? 40% of undocumented people in this country, by the way, didn't cross that border legally or quote unquote illegally. 40% of undocumented people in this country came perfectly legally on a visa, either for school or for work, overstayed the visa. A disproportionate number of them are not Mexican, they are not Central or South American, they are not Latinx at all. A large number of them are European. About 50,000 of them are Irish. Right? But we're not rounding up Irish Americans. ICE is not raiding, Irish pubs in Boston to try to root out those quote-unquote illegally here Irish folk. Right? But it's all based on selective memory. So we have the president saying at the time that he launched his campaign, remember he starts off and he says, Mexico isn't sending their best. Okay, but do y'all think England sent their best, like back in the day? Do you think that's where current white folks are from? Like we were the best of Europe? Y'all, we were the losers of Europe. The best never leave, y'all. You understand? Like the best never get on the boat, right? Because the best are kicking ass where they are. They don't need to leave. The best are winning, so they stay put because they're winning. Why would you leave when you are winning? Only the losers leave. And I don't mean losers negatively. I don't mean like that as a moral judgment. I just mean in the sense that you ain't making it, because if you were making it, you would not get on the damn boat. I always laugh when white folks will say things to me, because I guess they think I'll sympathize because I'm white. They'll be like, my family came over on the Mayflower. All right, shh. You might not want to brag about that shit if you actually knew who was on the Mayflower. You act like royalty was, who was not on the Mayflower? The king. The damn king was not on the boat. Nobody the king particularly wanted to keep around was on the boat. None of his close family or friends was on the boat. None of the super rich and powerful were on the boat because they were being super rich and powerful right where they damn were. The losers got on the boat, and then we turned them into winners. Oh my goodness, right? They came with these high-minded principles, but they didn't. That's what we say. We say, our family came for these principles of liberty and freedom. And those Mexicans and those Salvadorans, they're just coming for stuff. Man, all immigrants come for stuff, right? Our people came for stuff like land, stuff like the ability to live and not die in the streets of London or wherever it was we were living, right? At that time, like particularly Dickensian England, man, this was so funny when Trump called African nations shithole nations. The hell you think England was in the 1700s, y'all? Have you ever read Tale of Two Cities? And that's about France, but have you read Dickens' work about England, about France, about Europe? Shithole after shithole after shithole. It's not like Europeans came here with clean fingernails, right? But we act as if somehow they're coming to take advantage, but we had these high-minded principles. What high-minded principles? The colonists who came here didn't believe in liberty and freedom. How do we know that? Well, because they enslaved African folk, they murdered indigenous people, and then they went around when they, were tired of that, when they got a little exhausted from taking it out on brown folk, they just went around trying to find the witch in their own group. Right? That was like the history of the colonies was like looking for the witch because you weren't the right kind of Christian. Then they'd burn you or they'd hang you or they'd drown you. Right? They didn't believe in freedom. They didn't come for freedom. They came for stuff. And you know what? There's no shame in that. No shame in that. No shame in being the loser who can't make it where you're at. But there's no shame in it when that's an English person, a Scottish person, a German, or someone from Mexico. There's no shame when that person's from Guatemala. There's no shame when that person's from Sri Lanka. There's no shame when that person's from the continent of Africa. There's no shame when they are from wherever they are from, and they are coming for the same reasons that European peoples came. But our selective memory means we can't understand that. Or we say things like, well, I don't mind if they come as long as they come legally. What the hell does that even mean? Legally, like my family, that's what we say. Our family, there was no law to break, y'all, right? There was no law to break. So if your family that came here didn't break a law that wasn't even on the books yet, you don't get patted on the back for that. Like, I can't give you credit for not breaking a law when there was no damn law, you understand? And I'm quite certain Native people now, in retrospect, wish they had had some damn laws on the books, right, that they could have enforced against us. But it's selective memory. We act like we came the right way. We came the only way there was to come. And let me tell you something. When my great-grandparents came here from Russia, now most of my family's been here since the 1700s, even some the 1600s, but the last part of my family to come was the Jewish-Russian side, and they came in the early 1900s. And I guarantee you that if Russia had been right next door to the United States, if Russia had been contiguous to the United States the way Mexico is, and my great-grandparents had been as desperate as they were, and were being politically oppressed as they were at that time by the Tsar in Russia, I have absolutely no doubt that my great-grandfather would have crossed that border. The laws of the United States be damned. And if you're honest, you have to admit that your families would have done the same thing, right? The idea that they would have stayed in the places they were just so they didn't have to break the law, really? Do you actually foresee any of our ancestors, those of us called white, actually sitting there in Europe going, well, you know, I'd like to not starve this year. Be nice not to have to bury my kids. It'd be nice not to be thrown in jail or maybe killed by the head of state, but I wouldn't want to break the laws of the United States, so I think I'll just stay here and suffer. Are you kidding? We would do exactly what those folks from south of that border are doing, but we judge them and we elevate ourselves because of selective memory. If we can't see ourselves in them and we can't see them in us, then it becomes ever more difficult for us to create a real multiracial, multicultural democracy, or even to have legitimate immigration laws. It's not that nation states don't have the right to have immigration laws, but those have to be rooted in concepts of justice. And separating families at the border certainly is not justice. And then passing trade agreements that actually make some of those nations worse off, or destabilizing their governments, as we did all throughout Central America in the 1980s, and then being surprised when refugees pour in to the United States from places like El Salvador because we supported death squad activities there for 15 or 20 years and were involved and implicated in the murder of over 100,000 Salvadoran people. And then we act shocked when they want to flee the place that we wrecked. And then we want to close the border, but that's like setting a house on fire while people are inside and not letting them escape, right? You set fire to the house, you got to allow exits. But selective memory says we don't have to know any of that. We don't have to learn about it in school. We don't have to have politicians address it. You can grow up and be considered educated in this country and not know anything about any of that history that I just told you. Selective memory. It's not just that. It's also about the things that we never learn. So what I've talked about so far is the things that we remember and the things that we forget selectively. There's also some stuff we just never learn at all, right? And if you don't learn stuff, you can't teach stuff, right? Because you can't teach what you don't know, and you can't pass down wisdom that you've never had passed down to you. So think about some of the things we never learn and how that contributes to our divide artificially. So think about the reaction that some, not all, but some, and I would say a large number, of white folks have engaged in, the response that they've manifested in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. When the Black Lives Matter movement comes to prominence, you have a lot of white folks sort of get all up in our feelings about this, and we say things like, oh, but all lives matter. What about my life? What about me? Doesn't my life matter? Yes, sweetheart, it does. It does. I got white children. Their lives matter. Here's the difference. They know their lives matter. Because everything in this society tells them that. Their teachers make it clear. The cops make it clear. Employers make it clear. The media makes it clear. Everybody makes it clear. They don't doubt it for a second. Because this country's never made them doubt it, never led them to question it. That can't be said for peoples of color. Now, we can argue that we ought to also say Indigenous lives matter, Latinx lives matter, Asian American and Pacific Islander lives matter, and I'm down with that. But the reason we say Black lives matter is because for so long, blackness has been the floor beneath which others are not allowed to sink. And I guarantee you that when Black lives do matter, all lives will, right? But we have a hard time hearing it because why? We never learned the history of unequal law enforcement. So when white folks hear Black lives matter, we assume we're saying that they matter more than other people, that that's a special case, but it's not. You have to specify that which has been left out, y'all, right? You have to specify that which has been left out because we have said all for a very long time in this country, even when we didn't mean it. So Thomas Jefferson, what did he say? He said, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He said all, but at the time he wrote those pretty words, he owned over 200 human beings, so I gather he didn't really mean it, right? You can say all and leave out black folk, and they did. You can look at the Pledge of Allegiance, What are the last words of the Pledge of Allegiance? With liberty and justice for whom? For all, but that was written the first time in the 1880s. It was updated in the 1920s. The final version was not updated until the 1950s. And at no point in regard to those various iterations of the Pledge of Allegiance did we actually have liberty and justice for all. Yes, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution said that everyone was entitled to equal protection of the laws, but we know that in practice that wasn't actually happening. So we can say all and continue to forget black folk. And so when we say Black Lives Matter, that's a way of saying you don't get to say all until you're damn sure that black folks are part of your all. Because right now they're not. But if you don't learn that, if you don't understand the way that black folks and people of color generally, but especially black folks, have experienced law enforcement, a lot of this movement won't make sense. And I don't blame you for not getting it if you never learned that. Because the experience of white communities and black and brown communities when it comes to policing have been very different experiences, right? For black folks, they know, usually firsthand, or at least by tradition handed down to them, they know that the first iteration of policing in this country was the slave patrol. That's where policing really sort of gets its start, where they would take poor white folks, and poor white men in particular, right, who didn't really own any land, didn't own any property, definitely didn't own any slaves themselves, but the rich folks who did would take these poor folks and put them on the slave patrol to keep the black folks in line, because it was a way of getting those poor white folks on your team if you were rich, right? Sort of co-opt them onto your team and get them to identify more with the rich white people than they do with the poor black folks who they have a lot more in common with because they're all getting screwed by rich people, right? But you put them on the slave patrol, and that becomes the first policing. Black folks know that that law enforcement was directly implicated in the enforcement of every unjust law. The black codes in the South, convict leasing programs, debtor programs, or they would take black folks that they found without jobs and basically put them right back on the same plantations that their families had worked as enslaved people. Who do you think rounded them up and took them there? Cops. Who do you think was involved in lynchings? Who do you think it was that opened the doors of the jail and allowed people who were suspected of crime but hadn't been convicted of any crime into the hands of the mob? Who do you think turned them over? Cops. Who do you think pulled civil rights protesters off of those stools in the sit-in counters in the 1960s and beat them in the buses and watched as other mobs did the same? Cops did that. Cops are the ones who beat black folks on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. And this doesn't mean that all cops are brutal, and it doesn't mean that all cops are racist, but what it does mean is you cannot ignore the history of law enforcement vis-a-vis black folks and consider yourself remotely either educated or fair-minded. You cannot expect black folks to adopt amnesia as a cultural virtue. But that's sort of what we're doing. And of course it continues. It's police and law enforcement that has enforced the war on drugs that I mentioned before. Even though, as I said, the data is very clear from the Centers for Disease Control and every other source you can consult that white folks are just as likely or more so to use drugs and sell drugs, possess drugs. But we're not, as white folks, the ones being suspected, detected, searched, prosecuted, or incarcerated. Black and brown folks know that it's them, and that is at the hands of law enforcement. So it makes perfect sense to be skeptical of law enforcement. For those of us who are white, it wouldn't make as much sense. And I can tell you this from personal experience, that war on drugs thing is not about drugs, and I can tell you this now. I can confess to this because the statute of limitations has expired on this thing, and they cannot touch me now. 30 years ago, in April of 1988, I was in college. I was at Tulane University in New Orleans. And I was coming back in a rental car from San Antonio, where I had been at a college debate tournament at the University of Texas at San Antonio. In the car was myself, my debate partner, another two-person debate team, and the coach. And just outside of Gonzales, Texas, a little ways away from San Antonio, I get pulled over going about 15 miles an hour over the speed limit. As I'm pulling over to the side of the road, I'm very nervous. I'm nervous for two reasons. First reason is I'm always nervous when I get stopped by cops. I don't like the experience. It's not as bad for me usually as it is for black and brown folks, but it's not like I look forward to it, right? White folks don't look forward to these moments, even if we're not as scared perhaps as black and brown folks are, and with good reason. The second reason I'm nervous is because I know what is in the car, y'all. And by that, I do not mean debate evidence. I mean, I know what is in the briefcase of my debate coach at that very moment. And what is in the briefcase of my debate coach at that very moment are 2.5 ounces of weed, an 8 ball of cocaine, 6 sheets of ecstasy, and 12 hits of acid. For those of you not skilled in the narcotic arts, let me just assure you, that is way more drugs than you can personally do. And so if they pop you with that kind of stash on your person, you are not going to go down for simple possession, misdemeanor offense. You are going to go down for possession with intent to distribute, and you are going to do hard time, especially in Texas, but probably any place, and certainly in 1988. So I'm nervous. They pull me over. Cop comes to the window, raps on the thing with his flashlight. I roll the window down. And by the way, I made this motion because this is for young people. Y'all don't know this. But this is some shit we used to have to do with the windows, you know? I used to roll down, just so y'all know. It's like if I do this for a telephone, I know y'all are like, what the hell is that? That's a phone. If I do this, I'm dialing a phone, just so y'all know. So I'm pulled over. I roll down the window. The cop says, I need to see your license and registration. I said, okay, it's a rental car. I assume the registration's in the glove box. The guy next to me hands it to me, and I'm looking for my license, and I'm sweating already, right? I'm obviously nervous. And I can't find my license. I'm looking through my wallet. I cannot find it. I'm looking, I cannot find it. Probably only was about 30 seconds into this process, but it felt like 3 weeks into this process. The cop says, you want to come back to the patrol car and sit in the front? Maybe you can see better in there and find your license. I didn't really want to do this, but I figured I didn't have a whole hell of a lot of choice, right? So I go back to the cruiser. He's right, by the way. If you've not had the pleasure of sitting in the front of a cop car, let me just assure you the lighting is really damn good in there. So I'm sitting there looking through this wallet trying to find this ID. I still can't find it. I'm flipping. All of a sudden, I flip to my fake ID, right, which is really helpful in moments like this. The cop looks at it. He says, isn't that it? I'm like, no. I don't know what that is, man. That's like some kind of craft project. I don't know what that is. Even though it said Maine driver's license, as in the state of Maine. Not because I was from Maine, but because when we made that fake shit, we figured nobody knew what a real Maine license looked like, so we could just make it up however we damn well please, and nobody would know any better. He looks, he says, but it says. I'm like, yeah, I know, but that's not it. And I keep flipping, and suddenly I find the real one. Thank God. I pull it out. I hand it to him, sweating. I'm like, here it is. And my voice cracked like I was 13 again, right? And he goes, takes the license, looks me in the eyes, and says, sure this is the one you want to go with? I said, yep, that's it. That's it right there, Tennessee. That's where I'm from. That's me. That's my name. That's me right there. He says, okay. He writes me a $75 ticket, and he sends me on my way. Now, if you think that that interaction would have gone the same way had I been black or brown, you are not paying attention. And I don't mean to this lecture. I mean, you're not paying attention to life in general in America in 1988 or today. Because if I had been that nervous, and if I had had quite visibly in his presence a fake ID that he knew was fake itself, I should point out a misdemeanor offense that is punishable at that time by 60 days in jail and a $5,000 to $10,000 fine, depending on the state, there is no way that they don't toss that car. If I'm black or brown, they are going to toss that car. They are going to rip apart everything. They are going to find the drugs, and I'm going to jail. That's how I know about white privilege, and that's how I know about institutional racism, and that's why I understand a cry like Black Lives Matter, because it is very clear that the literal lives of black folks and then the figurative lives of black folks, the freedom of black folks has never mattered in the same way to the hands of law enforcement. And if we don't understand that, we can't understand ball players taking a knee. We see it as disrespectful because, oh my God, they're disrespecting the flag. That doesn't have anything to do with the flag. Disrespecting the anthem, it doesn't have anything to do with the anthem. It's just that the flag and the anthem are these symbols of a supposedly united America. And if America's not actually united, then that's the perfect time to take the knee to demonstrate that there's a contradiction between what we say and who we are and what we do. What better time? I know folks don't like it, but what better time to make a statement, and a peaceful one at that? Right? Folks will say, well, I don't mind if they protest. I just want them not to do it that way. But white folks have never been comfortable with black protests. It didn't matter how they did it. We weren't comfortable with the sit-ins. We look back at them now, right? You look at those protests in the 60s and everybody says, well, they should do it like that, you know? Real dignified, and they should all wear suits and ties and dresses and just sit there and just get pummeled, right? Putting aside the virtue of just getting pummeled, let's remember that when those folks were doing that, they were attacked for it. They were criticized for it. They were called troublemakers for it. Dr. King was actually accused of fomenting violence everywhere he went. Right? So we look back at it in retrospect, oh my gosh, how nice and peaceful. But at the very same time, as it was peaceful, but at the very same time, those who didn't like that movement found every way in the world to try to discredit it as not peaceful. Right? We've never liked black protest. So much so that by 1965, 1966, there was a poll that was taken, I think it was Gallup or Newsweek, one or the other, where they asked white folks what black folks should do now. Keep in mind, the civil rights movement was still going on. Civil Rights Act had just been passed a couple years before. The Voting Rights Act had just been passed. The Fair Housing Act wouldn't be passed for 2 more years. So there was still a lot of work to do, even just in the formal legal sense of breaking segregation. And yet, in this poll taken in 65 or 66, white folks said, overwhelming, like 3 out of 4 white folks said that if they were black, they would stop protesting now because everything is done, everything is fine, even by the mid-60s. So we say that now, everything's fine now, but we were saying that literally 50 years ago at a time when it clearly wasn't fine. Oh, we would stop protesting. This coming from the descendants of people who lost their shit over taxes on tea, y'all. Really? We wouldn't protest injustice, the likes of which black folks were experiencing, but we couldn't handle that tea tax. Oh, dump it in the harbor. My God, let's have a revolution. Right? And so, again, the things we never learn make it very hard for us to understand why folks are taking that knee. And if you don't understand the history that brought us here, then you really can't make sense of the current political situation and the election of, and the aftermath of the election of President Trump. And let me explain what I mean by that. Actually, before I do that, I want to do one more thing before I talk about Trump. I want to talk about this issue of the importance of memory as it relates to us on a very personal and human level, because it isn't just a political level. I mean, it is, but it has personal consequences. A couple years back, I was taking my kids to the dance studio where they were in the dance company. We live in Nashville, Tennessee, and the school that they attend is like 8-minute drive to the studio downtown. And they were like 10 and 12 at the time they were in this company, in this particular dance company. So we're headed down there, and it's a drive that we make all the time, like 4 or 5 times a week at that point for like a year. And on this particular day, something very interesting happened. We got stopped about halfway to our destination at a red light. And this red light happens to be in the middle of a public housing community in Nashville, just down the road from their school. And so we're sitting there at the red light waiting for it to turn green. The 10-year-old, whose name is Rachel, sitting in the back seat, she says, she's looking around, and she says, "Daddy, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black?" And I thought to myself, well, now that is a really great question. And I was impressed, right, because my 10-year-old is doing urban anthropology in the back of my Highlander, which is really impressive stuff at 10, you know. And I was also real excited because this is like the one question Daddy knows the answer to, right? Like, when you're a parent, you will take your victories wherever the hell you can find them, because I'm telling you, lots of times your kids ask you shit you have no idea. If my kid had said, "Daddy, where does electricity come from?" I'd have been like, "Psh, aren't y'all studying that? You got a phone, it's got Google, look it up." Or I would do what parents always do when we don't know the answer to something, but we want to sound like we're being like really good parents. So the kid asks a question and we're like, "I don't know, what do you think?" That always means I don't know the damn answer. I'm hoping you can tell me, just so you know. That's what that means, right? So she asked me, but this is the one question, right? To ask me a question about race in America and why people live where they live, I got that one. Like, that one I actually know something about, so I'm ready to show off my wisdom to my kid. And like I said, you take victories wherever you can find them as a parent. So I got the answer right here. Now, it's the 3-minute answer, right? Because I can't do the PhD answer. Because A, I got 3 minutes before we're at the studio, and B, my kids are 10 and 12. They can't handle the PhD answer, but I'm going to give them the thumbnail sketch, right? So I get ready to give them the answer, and then something happened that I did not know was going to happen because I am an only child. But I learned that day that apparently when a younger sibling asks a question of a parent in the presence of the older sibling, inevitably, and without much delay, the older sibling will offer up their own answer just to prove how damn smart they are in the presence of the parent. So I'm ready with my answer. Remember the question. The 10-year-old says, "Daddy, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black?" The 12-year-old Ashton jumps in and says, "Redlining." And I was like, "What?" It's like, do you just know things? It's like, did your mom give birth to a sociological savant? What the hell was that? How did you know that term? For those who don't know it, let me break it down so you know. Redlining is a thing that was perfectly legal and happened all the time for generations, where banks would take literal red markers, they put maps on the wall in the bank, they would take the red marker and mark around the outside of black neighborhoods. And anyone who lived within the boundaries of that neighborhood would not be able to get a loan. You wouldn't be able to get a home loan, you wouldn't be able to get a business loan, you wouldn't be able to get an equity loan if you already owned a home. You were basically shut out of having capital. It didn't matter if you had good credit, it didn't matter if you had a good job, it didn't matter what your income or your education was. Just living in that black community meant you were screwed, right? And that happened generation in and generation out, and it was totally legal until 1968, and it still happens indirectly. But it used to happen directly. And when my kid said that, I didn't know where she got that. The 10-year-old was like, "I don't know what that means." I'm like, "I don't think your sister does either, but that was one hell of a guess." It's actually not quite right, though. I'm going to give my kid half credit. It's not quite right. Redlining is how the neighborhood became poor, right? It is how it became poor, because that's how the neighborhood got starved of capital, of equity, of cash. That's not quite how it became black, though. Here's how it became black, and I explained this to them. I said, public housing, we think of now, because the media portrays it as such, and we tend to think of it as such, is this thing for poor black people, but it wasn't created for poor black folks. It was created for poor white folks. And for the first several years of its existence, black and brown folks couldn't even get into public housing in most of the places where it existed. It was created for poor white folks. But at the same time that the government created these programs to help out poor and struggling white folks during the Depression, they also created some loan programs that were specifically targeted to whites as well. The FHA loan program, the VA loan program later than that, the GI Bill benefit program, right, which in theory were open to everyone, but in practice were almost exclusively for whites for the first 30 years. And so at the very same time the government's doing public housing for poor whites, they're also subsidizing whites to get out of the cities and move to the suburbs and the smaller towns, where they can get these loans that only they can get in neighborhoods where only we as whites will be allowed to live. So the government is literally subsidizing white flight, literally guaranteeing loans that will make it easier for whites to leave the cities where the jobs are now going and where the schools are better and where they pick up the trash twice a week, right? And who's left behind? Black and brown folks are left behind. And then redlining guarantees that they won't have access to capital. So the neighborhoods become black, or these neighborhoods become white because of overt discrimination and government policy to facilitate that discrimination. And then they become poor, or they become affluent because some have access to capital and others don't. End of the lesson. We're at the dance studio. I let the kids out. And as I'm driving away, I have two emotions at once. One is I'm feeling pretty good because I feel as though, all right, I feel like I broke it down pretty good. They seem to get it, like, mission accomplished in that regard. But I also had this feeling of horror come over me, right? And the feeling of horror was based in this realization that what happens if I don't know the answer to her question? And how many parents wouldn't know the answer to her question? See, black parents probably would because they've lived that reality, right? People of color generally have a better understanding of how things got the way they got. But for white parents, how do we learn that stuff? That's not in the history classes that we took. I took AP history in high school, y'all. That's the history for the smart people. That's what they say. But they didn't think we were smart enough to handle that truth, so they didn't tell us that, right? I had to learn that stuff afterwards. So if a white child, mine or anyone else, asked that question, how did this neighborhood get this way, poor and black, and I don't know the answer, what do you think my kid concludes? She's not going to stop wondering just because I don't know the answer. She's going to keep wondering, and she's going to fill in the blank herself. How's she going to fill it in? Y'all know the only possible answer is what? It's the answer this culture gives to every one of us to explain the reason that things are the way they are. What's that? The one thing we all got taught. Every last one of us in this country got taught what? It's our secular gospel. It's Genesis 1:1 in the Bible of Americanism. It's the idea that wherever you end up is all about you. Right? Rugged individualism, meritocracy. If you want to make it, all you got to do is try hard. And if you didn't make it, it's your own damn fault. You ought to double down and try harder. We've all been taught that. The problem is, we've been taught that even though we know that's not really how it works. We all know people who've worked hard their whole lives, got nothing to show for it, maybe in our own families. And we all know people that were born on third base but think they hit a triple and have never had to work hard a day in their lives. There are even people, I am told, who got to take over their daddy's real estate portfolio in the 1970s and early 80s in New York City when that portfolio was worth $200 million and property was cheap and could be bought for a song, and then proceeded to become a millionaire and wants y'all to think he's a self-made man. Okay. Right? So do you understand this idea that we just can be anything we want if we work hard? The problem is we know there are tons of exceptions to that, and many of those exceptions are identity-based. People of color have not had the same access. Women of all colors have not had the same access. Poor people in general have not had the same access, not had the same connections, not had the same resources. So we tell this pretty tale to our children. You can be anything if you work hard, but if we don't tell them about the barriers that exist, and that part of working hard is knocking down those barriers, then we're setting people up. Not only are we setting them up for failure, but we are setting them up to do what? Rationalize the inequalities they see. So back to my daughter in that question. If I don't know the reason the neighborhood looks the way that it does, and she fills in the blank with that American myth that, well, we all end up where we are because of our own effort, then what is her conclusion going to be? Her conclusion is going to be, these folks live here like this because there's something wrong with them. And white folks live over there like that because we're better. In other words, if we don't explain the history, if we don't understand the context, if we don't understand the predicate of what we're seeing right now, the default position is one that rationalizes racial inequity, rationalizes economic inequity, rationalizes gender inequity. Because after all, wherever you end up is all about you. Racism becomes a default under that kind of thinking. So this is dangerous for us to not understand the past and how it affects the present. Now the thing about Trump real quick. One of the things that's been bothersome to me in the wake of the election, I mean, a lot has been bothersome to me in the wake of the election, as you can imagine, but this has been especially troubling. One of the things I hear from a lot of liberal folks. It's bad enough what I hear from right-wing folks, but I sort of expect that. One of the things that I hear from liberal folks, especially white liberal folks, that bothers me is you'll hear us say things like, this isn't normal. This is just unprecedented. This is not normal. This is just something different. This is not who we are as a country. Really? I mean, what exactly? I mean, given, 5 a.m. rage tweeting from the Oval Office is not normal. That's true. Like, that is some new shit, okay? That's different. That's different. But other than that, what's really abnormal about this? About a rich white man telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. Like, since when is that new? That's not new. That's the oldest play in the playbook of American politics. Rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown folks. That goes back to the colonies. Back to a time when we weren't even white yet. Most people don't realize that. Most people don't realize that whiteness was invented in the colonies of what became the United States. We weren't one big happy family in Europe, man. We hated each other. Spent most of European history killing each other. But in the colonies, we suddenly start to call ourselves white. Why? Because the rich looked around and they could see that African enslaved folks and European indentured servants, who were just one level above a slave themselves, had a lot in common. The biggest thing they had in common was they were all getting screwed over by the landowners, and they were worried that those groups were going to get together and overthrow their stuff. Because there were rebellions. Bacon's rebellion was one. There were others where the poor of all colors would come together to overthrow the aristocracy in places like the Virginia colony. So now the rich have to divide and conquer these people. They have to split these coalitions and get those Europeans on their side. That's why they put them on the slave patrol. That's why they got rid of indentured servitude. That's why they started extending certain rights to them as a way to say, your enemies are black and brown, help us keep them in line. And these folks got in line, and all of a sudden those rebellions stopped. Divide and conquer. It's not new. Fast forward to the Civil War era, right? When the rich stand up and they admit the reason they want to break away from the Union and go to war is to maintain slavery. They admitted it then. We lie about it now. Okay? We lie about it now. But back in the day, there was no shame around it. And so my people in the South, we just straight up said it. Alexander Stephens said the cornerstone of the Confederate government was the, quote, great truth that the Negro is not the equal of the white man, end of quote. That's what he said, right? That's what all of the Confederate leaders made clear. But the thing was, the rich didn't want to fight the war, man. Rich people don't go to war. They get poor people to do that shit. Rich people get doctors to write notes saying they have heel spurs so they don't have to go to Vietnam. That's what rich people do. Right? They send poor people to fight and die for them. But now if I'm poor and I don't own any slaves, why the hell would I go fight so you can keep yours? That doesn't make any damn sense. I don't even have a direct stake in this thing, man. But you come to me and tell me I got to go fight so you can keep your stuff? Why would I do it? The only reason I would do it is because you come to me and you say, oh, if these people get free, they're going to take your job, white man. No, fool, they already got your damn job. That's the point, man. If I can make a slave work for free and I got to pay your ass $1 a day, guess who I'm going to hire? I'm going to hire free. Because over the long run, that's going to save me money. So in other words, poor white people would have been better off getting together with African enslaved folks and overthrowing all of that nonsense. But instead, they went out and fought and died, and hundreds of thousands of them lost their lives over a lie. Because rich folks convinced them their enemies were black and brown. Fast forward to the immigration moment we're in right now, and it's the same. Oh, your jobs will come back if we just build that wall. Really, you think that's how capitalism works? You just build a wall, and all of a sudden, all the bosses of America are like, oh, well, you figured it out. Here's a big fat raise. That doesn't happen. Under capitalism, the boss can still send the plant overseas. They can still invest their money overseas. Capital will always be moving. Goods will always be moving. Basic economics says if we allow capital to move and we allow goods to move, but we don't allow labor to move in search of the highest wage, that all workers end up losing in the long run. Not just the ones south of that border, but all workers who'd be better off with a larger and more militant working class movement fighting for better wages and better working conditions. But we've convinced folks. I got an email from a dude a couple years ago, young guy. I knew it was going to be crazy because it was all capital letters. And it was red font, man. Just, why you got to do red font? Just take the cap lock off and just talk to me. You don't have to scream at me. But he was screaming at me, and he was saying, I can't get a job because all the jobs are going to blacks and Mexicans. Really? All the jobs are going to blacks and Mexicans? That's sort of funny because I looked up the Labor Department data, and the Labor Department data says that black folks are twice as likely as white folks to be unemployed even when they have the same level of education. And it said that Latinx folks, including Mexican American and Chicano folks, are approximately 80%, 70 to 80% more likely than white folks to be unemployed even when they have the same level of education. So the idea that white folks can't get jobs, white folks are more likely to have jobs, so where the hell are black and brown folks taking these jobs? Where are these jobs? Are they in Second Life? Are they on Minecraft digging ditches or some shit? Where are these jobs at that they're talking about? But he's convinced because rich white men have convinced him that's why he can't find work. And by the way, I just found it interesting when people like this guy say, took my job, because that's what he said, so-and-so took my job. First of all, when they say took my job, did you have the job yet? Because if you didn't have the job, that shit was not yours to take. Let's just be clear about that. Right? Like, I might be more sympathetic. Like, it would be unfair. Let me just say this. It would be unfair if, like, the boss was calling up Jim on Monday, the white guy, and be like, Jim, congratulations. You got the job. You start on Wednesday. And then, like, Wednesday morning, the boss called back and was like, nah, Jim, I was just kidding. I'm giving the job to Jose. Like, that would be unfair. Right? That would be a little cruel. But that's not what's happening. Nobody's taking somebody else's job. Right? The reality is employers are hiring folks trying to get the cheapest wage, and oftentimes they will take advantage of and exploit the legal status of undocumented people because they know undocumented people can't sue them for mistreatment. They know undocumented people have virtually no rights. If you want to actually deal with the quote-unquote problem of undocumented migration, extend rights to undocumented people once they're here, and I promise you, a lot of that will end. But we don't want to protect undocumented people. We want to leave them legally vulnerable. But do you understand when you leave them legally vulnerable, that's when they get hired? In New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, 40,000 Honduran workers were brought in specifically, most of them undocumented, to rebuild the city, and virtually none of them got paid. Why? Because the employers could screw them and know that they didn't have any legal recourse. That's the problem, right? If you want to discourage undocumented crossing, there are two things you can do. One is extend rights to all people equally, and then number two is actually create a system whereby it becomes easier to migrate legally. See, when folks say that they want people to come, but come the right way, they don't mean that because they don't want to make it easier for them to come. If you really wanted them to come, we could make it easier, man. We could streamline the process. We could put the money into it, right? But we don't do that. We don't want folks coming at all. That's why now the administration's talking about even cutting back on legal immigration from certain places, at least. They just don't want certain people. It has nothing to do with immigration. It has everything to do with their fear of changing the demographic reality of America. But I got news for you. The demographic reality of America is not really because of immigration. Over the last 10 to 12 years, there's been a net decrease, a net outflow of migrants from south of that border, more leaving than are coming in. So the idea that that's going to solve the quote-unquote problem isn't true. If that were true, the problem would already be solving itself, because the numbers are actually declining in the last 10 to 12 years over the last two administrations. The demographic change is mostly the result of white folks on average being older, about 10 to 12 years older than Latinx folks on average, and older folks just don't have as many babies. This is just sort of basic biology, right? So the fertility rates are different, right? The younger folks have more children, older folks have fewer children, so the group that's having fewer children is going to diminish as a percentage of the population, and the group that's younger and therefore has more kids, right, are going to increase as a share of the population. So if white folks ain't happy with this, y'all just going to have to start having a lot more sex and having a lot more babies and stop whining about people of color taking your stuff, right? There's other things you can do to solve the problem if you're really so inclined, right? But we don't want to talk about any of this. We'd rather act as if this is unprecedented and new. It isn't. Rich white people telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown, allowing us to rationalize the disparities rather than get busy solving them on behalf of all of us. But one final thing I want to leave you with before I take questions, and we've got mics down here for you who want to ask questions. I do want to leave you with some sense of hope, or at least, if not hope, a recognition of the capacity that we have as people, both as human beings and as Americans, to make change around these issues. Because some of the picture that I'm painting is rather bleak, but I want you to remember that if this isn't really a new problem, then that means we don't have to come up with brand new solutions. We can learn from what people have done before. We can take power and we can take resolve and we can take inspiration from what they've done before, right? If it's a new thing, you don't know how to respond to it. It makes it scarier. It's like when I was a kid, I used to have a superpower, and it wasn't like a really cool one, like flying or seeing through walls and stuff like that, or invisibility, but it was still pretty cool. I had this superpower that allowed me to get out of nightmares. So if I was having a nightmare, being chased by a monster or a guy with a knife or something, I could just blink my eyes really hard and I would wake up. It was awesome. I could turn around, look at the monster, look at the mean guy, blink my eyes, and I was out, right? The only time this didn't work was when the monster was new. Like if it was a monster I'd never seen before, or if it was a different guy chasing me than the one who was normally chasing me, then sometimes I might have to blink 3 times to get out, and sometimes it wouldn't work at all, and I would just have to find a hiding space until the morning kind of thing, right? But the good news here is that this monster that we're dealing with right now in terms of racism, the monster of anti-immigrant xenophobia, the monster of anti-black and brown bigotry, the monster politically that we're dealing with as such right now really isn't new. This is the same monster that's been under the bed the whole time for 400 years, which means we can take heart from the movements that have gone up against that monster before. And if you have the chance to go to Washington, D.C. and go through the Museum of African American History and Culture, you should absolutely take that opportunity. If you've already done it, you should go back again as many times as you can, because when you go there, that's where you get that inspiration. I went for the first time shortly after the election. It was between the election and the inauguration. It was a very poignant moment to be there because the museum is only about 500 yards from the back door of the White House and sits in the shadow of the Washington Monument. You go in, and it's incredible what's in there. I mean, Emmett Till's original casket is there. Nat Turner's Bible is there. There's a statue of Thomas Jefferson, very interestingly, and it's sort of shrouded in shadows. And behind it is a big granite wall. And on the wall are his words that I mentioned earlier, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And what's very poignant about that is that behind the statue, in between him and the wall, there's another wall, a brick wall, that has the names of people on it. And at first, you don't know what the names are, but if you get close enough, it's not hard to figure it out. These are the names of the human beings that Jefferson owned at the time that he wrote those pretty words. And the contrast is striking, but what's especially striking is you remember in that moment that a committed movement of black and white abolitionists were able to bring down the power of the slavocracy, including this man whose statue stands before you. You realize that even someone as powerful and as intelligent and as capable as Thomas Jefferson, and yet as evil in many ways as well, could be brought down by the committed actions of people insistent on justice. And then you keep walking through the museum and you see the pictures of George Wallace in Alabama and Lester Maddox in Georgia, both segregationist governors. And you see Bull Connor in Birmingham, the chief of police turning the water cannons and the dogs on children in 1963 who were protesting segregation. And you see Sheriff Jim Clark in Selma having his goons beat civil rights protesters within an inch of their life on that bridge in 1965. And what you remember is that George Wallace is dead and black people are still here, that Lester Maddox is dead and black people are still here, that Jim Clark and Bull Connor are dead and people of color are still here fighting this fight. And if those monsters could not slay the movement for justice and liberation, I am fairly confident that Donald John Trump ain't the one, y'all. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you. Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes, roughly. We got a couple of mics here. If you'd like to come to the mic for a question, do that. If you're not physically able, or if you're someone who just is like shy about getting in front of people and talking, I get that. I don't really get it because I do this for a living, but I'm told that's a thing, so I understand and I sympathize, even if I can't relate. So we'll get a mic to you if that's the case. Yes.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Tim. Thank you so much for that information.
Thank you.
I am very privileged that I did go to that museum, and I can't wait for an opportunity to take my grandkids back. You said a lot of good things about a lot of current issues. I was just hoping that there would be a push somewhere to be teaching the next generation about some of these things that you talked about. Right. And my question is, if anybody is addressing what happened with the immigrants and their children, because from what I understand, a lot of those children have not been returned to their parents.
Yeah, there's still, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but I know there's still several hundred at least who have not been reunited with their families, and it's hard to get accurate counts because I think a lot of this is being kept from us and sort of swept under the rug now that it's off the front page of the news and we're on to the next horrible thing. So there are groups that are working on this. The ACLU is obviously working on, has been since the very beginning, some of the family separation issues. They've been filing, trying to get injunctions, filing lawsuits. Some of those are still working their way through the courts. Some of those have resulted in the reunification of families. So there's been some victory in that regard on the part of those lawsuits filed by or in tandem with the ACLU, as well as various other immigrant rights groups around the country. It's very important for us to understand what is happening and to understand the depths of depravity that are involved when you rip children from their parents. And I understand, people will try to rationalize this and they will say, well, they shouldn't have brought them here illegally if they were worried about that happening. But a couple of points. Number one, many of these folks were seeking legal asylum. Now, they may or may not have a legit asylum claim, but there's a process for figuring that out. And they are coming to seek asylum, and then that's a legal thing. That's not illegal. That's not breaking the law. They're not simply running across the border with their kid in a backpack and getting caught. That's not what this is. And they are being separated even when presenting legally. So there is a problem when a policy includes that kind of thing. Obviously, we want to have a stable immigration process. We want to make it safer for everyone. And the reality is when we make it more difficult, it's very dangerous for the families and for the children. We don't want families to be taking their lives in their hands to cross a border and possibly die of thirst in the desert or get shot at by militiamen or whatever. Nobody wants that. But that's why we need to streamline and make the process easier rather than making it so difficult that desperate people will take those desperate measures and possibly die or have their kids ripped from them. It's not a reason to make it harder to come. It's a reason to make it easier and more lawful to come. And what we're doing instead is ripping children away in a way that I cannot fathom we would do if these individuals were of European descent. I don't believe, for instance, that we would be doing this. Back in the 90s, there was a refugee crisis in Central Europe, Bosnia, Herzegovina, former Yugoslavia, and a lot of quote-unquote white people who, interestingly enough, have not always historically been viewed as white. Central European Slavic peoples have not always been seen as white, right? Not as the same way English folks are, for instance. But they certainly qualify in most people's minds as white now. And there was a lot of sympathy for these Central European refugees who were in the midst of a war and all kinds of political instability. And I don't think that if they had been presenting themselves for asylum, as many were, and trying to escape that situation, that we would have taken their children from them or arrested them and tried to send them back. We certainly didn't do that. And so it suggests to me there's something about it that's very explicitly racial and ethnic. Next question, please. Yes.
Good day, and welcome back. I have two questions for you.
Okay.
Can you give us a working definition as to what is racism?
Sure. So there are two you know how words sometimes have two definitions in the dictionary, right? A A and a B. So the A definition, or number one, I would say racism as an ideology, as a thought process, is the belief in the superiority or inferiority of a given group of people defined racially, which is usually defined by color and or ancestral origin. So that's the belief system. It's the belief in superiority or inferiority. The systemic definition, which would be the number two, or the little b definition, and the reason I say there has to be one is because isms are both ideas and systems, right? Capitalism is an idea, it's also a system. Socialism, same thing. Racism, same thing. Racism as a system, I would define as a system of inequality based on race that is perpetuated by policies, practices, and procedures, some of them formal, some of them informal, which have the effect of either creating or perpetuating inequalities on the basis of race.
Okay.
So those are the two definitions.
Great answer. So my next question would be, is there such thing as racism in reverse?
So with regard to the first definition, the one about what you think in your head, the answer to that could be yes. With regard to the second one, the answer really can't be anything but no, and let me explain why. At the ideological level, anybody can be racist, right? You can think that white people are inferior, you can think that black or Asian or Latino folks are superior, and so you can be, in your head at least, I guess, a racist in reverse, right, or whatever, or just a racist. Mm-hmm. The problem is, at the institutional level, you can't do much with that, right? Because you just don't have the power to take what's in your head and actually bring it out here in the world and do a lot of damage. So not saying you can't ever, but for the most part, like you think about who's the most powerful person of color you can think of historically in our country, it's Barack Obama, I would imagine. And here's a guy who still had to get white folks to vote for him. So it's not like even if he hated white people, which he does not, but even if he hated white people, what was he going to do to us, right? I mean, he's going to oppress us and then he's not going to get reelected. I mean, you know, so even the most powerful black guy you can think of can't get away with shit, right? So I think a person of color can be racist ideologically, but systemically in practice, no. And so it's sort of like if you think of racism as a stationary combustion engine, right? It doesn't, until you put fuel in it, right? It doesn't actually go anywhere. It doesn't actually do anything. And so the fuel would be the power that makes it institutionalized. So I can look at that stationary engine and go, well, it's an engine, but it ain't a very effective one, right? So that's how I would answer that.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Go ahead.
What can I do as a white, straight, cis male to help advocate and help with problems that don't affect me on a daily basis?
I think the first is to acknowledge and realize that they do affect you. They affect all of us on a daily basis, maybe indirectly. They're certainly not targeted at us, for sure, which is probably what you mean by that question, I would imagine. I think the second thing is we have to really listen to what people of color are saying that we need to be talking about with our friends and our family. A lot of times I think those of us who want to be allies or co-conspirators or whatever term we use, we spend a lot of time, understandably so, trying to seek out those multiracial moments where we can work together, and that's important. But just as important is what do we do when we're just with our people, right? Which often happens because we live in neighborhoods that are usually mostly white, and we have families that are mostly white. And when we, are talking to our friends, disproportionately, our friend circles are racially same as us, and oftentimes, gender similar and sexually similar and class similar. So we've got to, when we're in those homogenous spaces, we have to be prepared to push into those uncomfortable places. And one of the ways that I think we can do that is by asking questions of our family and our friends. It's not about making declarative statements. I had some white folks ask me last November, right before Thanksgiving, I was doing a speech in Colorado, and these students were like, I'm going home for Thanksgiving. What the hell do I say to my racist uncle? Because apparently all white people have a racist uncle. We don't seem to have racist parents, but we have racist uncles all the time. And they were like, what do I say? And I said, well, okay, first, let's slow down. I said, you don't just go in and start saying shit. Like, that's just not going to work at Thanksgiving or anywhere else. Like, don't bust out your intersectional feminist theory class materials, even though that stuff is awesome. That is not going to work with your uncle around the Thanksgiving table. What you need to do is, when this stuff comes up, which it probably will, as it so often does, ask some questions, or maybe even initiate a conversation by asking questions to try to find out, why do your family members or why does your family member think the way they think? Why does your friend or your roommate or your colleague at work think the way they think? Because if you can figure out what someone is afraid of, or why it is that they are hostile to certain peoples and groups and things, then it becomes easier to figure out how to respond, right? That person could have a number of different things that are going on in their head, and you need to figure out what they are. So part of this is a dialogue that we have to engage in. And we have to also be willing to tell our stories. One of the best ways that we can support people of color is not by telling their truth, right? They need to tell their truth, and if we can help create space for them to tell their truth, all the better. One of the reasons I started my podcast was I wanted to provide amplification to, especially to people of color who are out there doing activist work who maybe don't get as much attention as they should. But even if you don't have a podcast or a platform, you can do that in your own life by going to events that are sponsored by people of color, by letting people know about the books and the videos online that are done by people of color, or blogs by folks of color. But it also is about telling our own story. So as a straight, white, cisgendered male, being able to sit and talk about, well, what does that mean in your experience, right? The reason I wrote White Like Me, my first book, and the reason I told some personal stories today, the thing about my girls and the thing about the drugs, is because I think that's how we're going to actually move people, is by talking about our own experiences with privilege, our own experiences with whiteness, our own experiences around our identity, rather than trying to tell black and brown folks' stories better. They can obviously tell their own stories, but we are the authors of our script. And so it's for us to share that as a way to open other people up to the reality of what's going on in the country.
Thank you.
One more over here, and then I will let you all get out.
My question is, how you as an individual, what might have happened or something that you might have experienced that made you want to spread your knowledge on this, because it's not every day that someone like you would know all the things that you do.
Well, it was a process, and it begins early. I went to preschool. My mother enrolled me, I should say, and deliberately so, in a preschool that was at a historically black college in Nashville. So I went to preschool at Tennessee State University in 1972 when I was 4 years old. And she made that decision because she wanted to socialize me in a non-dominant environment. She knew I was going to be in a public school system that had really only just fully integrated by the early 70s. And she wanted me to have an experience that would be positive and that I wouldn't feel odd and out of place in mixed classrooms the way that probably previous generations would have. And so I went there, and what I think was important about that was that it meant a couple of things. It meant, first of all, that most of my peer group were going to be black kids. And the reason that was important, I realized, like, all white people say we have black friends, and we're usually lying, right? But in this case, like, I didn't have anything but. For the first couple of years, my earliest friendships were black kids. And so when I got into elementary school, and I'm watching the black kids be treated differently, like, I'm watching, they're getting punished, but we're all acting up. They're the ones being sent to the office. Or we're being split and put into different ability groups, and the white kids are all in the advanced level, and the black kids are mostly in the remedial or basic level. Most white kids probably wouldn't have thought twice about that, because to them, that level of separation was normal. For me, that was weird. To have the black kids over there and the white kids over here, it just didn't make any sense. That's not what I had experienced in preschool. So I remember just thinking about that. I didn't know what to call it. Like, I didn't have language for it yet. I was 5 years old. I was 6 years old. It's not like I went home the first week of school at the age of 5 or 6 and was like, Mom, you are not going to believe the institutional white supremacy at the elementary school. This is crazy shit. Like, that didn't happen. But I knew something was going on, and I filed it away, and it stuck with me. And the other thing going to Tennessee State did, it meant that I was being subordinated to black authority, because it was black folks, and particularly black women, who ran that program. And so when you're 4 years old, being subordinated to black women's authority in 1972, you learn some stuff. And particularly what you learn is to respect black women's knowledge and wisdom and what they say. And so 23 years later, when I'm working as a community organizer in public housing in the city of New Orleans, mostly with African American women, my mind is going back to that early imprinting and early conditioning where I learned to listen and to respect rather than challenge the authority and say, you know, because this is what a lot of white folks will do. When black folks tell us what's up, we'll be like, are you sure? I think you might be exaggerating the problem. I think you might be misinterpreting your own life. I'm not going to be that dude, because I was told to respect black authority, and particularly the authority of black women. So in that regard, that was a critical thing for me. But what ultimately did it, I mean, that's a nice, cornerstone foundation. But what ultimately did it was, in 1990, I graduated from college, and I was in school in Louisiana. That was the year that David Duke, former Klan leader, lifelong neo-Nazi and white supremacist, was running for the United States Senate. In 91, he ran for governor of Louisiana. Both elections he lost. I was involved in the campaigns against him. I was the associate director of the organization that was founded for the purpose of defeating him. And even though he lost, he came very close. In 1990, when he ran for the Senate, he got 6 out of 10 white people to vote for him. And it wasn't because they didn't know he was a Nazi. Everybody knew he was a Nazi, but 6 out of 10 white people just didn't give a damn. They just voted for him anyway. In the governor's race, did a little better, but 55% of white folks still voted for him. And at the end of those 2 elections, myself and all the other folks involved sat around trying to figure out, what does this mean for us that 6 out of 10 people who fill out the census form the same way that we do voted for somebody they know is a Nazi? Because I knew in my heart and my mind, 6 out of 10 Louisianans aren't Nazis. 6 out of 10 white Louisianans are not Nazis. They're not Klansmen. They're not horrible bigots, but they were willing to vote for a guy who was all of those things. And what did that mean? And for me, what it meant was I had to commit my life to doing this work, because it wasn't fair for us to rely on black people to save us. Because that's what they did in Louisiana. Black folks went out and basically saved us. You know, it's like, y'all are going to vote for the Nazi? Okay, not today. We're going to stop you. And so black folk, now there were like 2 black guys that voted for him, because there's always a couple, right? There's always a couple that lose their mind and do some crazy shit. You know, I don't know who they were, but you always got a couple people that lose their mind. But black folks saved us from ourselves. And at some point, it's like, we have to, we like to preach self-help to other people. We like to tell black and brown folks, y'all need to help yourselves and stop being dependent on other people. But we are as dependent as anybody. And in that case, we were utterly dependent on black folks to keep us from having a Klansman and a Nazi as the U.S. Senator from Louisiana or the governor of Louisiana. And so I realized that it was my job. I can't ask other people to save my people from the harm that we do, not just to others, but to ourselves. Somebody has to liberate white people from white supremacy, and the only ones that can do that are other white people. So that was the story, and I'm sticking to it. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it.